Okay, I guess let's get started. Hello everyone, welcome to the SNAPP seminar series. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Wein joining us today to give a talk. Professor Larry Wein is the Jeffrey S. Skoll Professor of Management Science and the Senior Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the Graduate School of Business, Stanford. His research interests are in operations management and public health. He was editor-in-chief of operations research from 2000 to 2005, and has been awarded many awards. I won't list all of them here, but these include things like, for example, the Erlang Prize, the Cookman Prize, the Frederick W. Lanchester Prize from Informs. He's an Informs Fellow, MSOM Fellow, and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. Today he's going to talk about analysis of the genealogy process in forensic genetic genealogy. So Larry, please. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. This is joint work with former Stanford PhD student Minay Suer-Turk and the co-founders of the DNA Doe Project, Colleen Fitzpatrick and Margaret Press. So most of the papers or talks presented in the SNAPP series, I think, focus on stochastic process theory. This talk won't. Instead, I'll be introducing you to a problem that I think is really interesting. You may have read about it in the newspapers, or if you watch a CSI TV show, you may have seen it, but you probably don't know too much about it. So first, I want to put the paper in a broader context of my research in recent years on crime. And so the goal is of this stream of research is to reduce the number of type 1 and type 2 errors with respect to incarceration. So for the type 1 errors, there are a number of people who are incarcerated, who are not violent and probably don't belong behind bars. And so I have one paper based on the California overhaul of their prison system dictated by the US Supreme Court, which led to overcrowding of the county jails in California. So it's kind of a queuing network model of jails. And this is appeared in PLOS 1, and I had an op-ed summarizing the recommendations in the New York Times. I have ongoing work using data from South Carolina on judge rotation. So judges move around the different counties in South Carolina. As a result, the defendants shop around for lenient judges. And as a result, the average and variance of the sentence that they receive is less. And so we look at the game theoretic and operational details of this. But most of my work has been on reducing the type 2 errors, that is, solving violent crime. So about 60% of homicides go unsolved. Most sexual assaults are not reported, but at least a third of those that are reported are not solved. And so the first paper I have on this is on ballistic imaging. So when you shoot a gun off, a cartridge case will pop out of the gun, and there'll be scratches on the cartridge casing that are quite unique to the gun. So you take photographs of these scratchings, and it becomes like a fingerprint for the gun. And this, the main paper appeared in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. This is using data from Stockton, California, and working with their police department. And as a result of this paper, it led to a number of the recommendations being adopted nationwide by the ATF. So a key finding in the paper is that ballistic imaging has increasing returns to scale. So the more you do it, the more effective it is. And the federal government buys the hardware and software for all the cities to do this. And many cities only process their homicides, which is like 10% of their cases. So the federal government then dictated that if you don't process 100% of all your cartridges, we're going to take our equipment and go home, basically. So they're kind of forcing everyone to do this. They recommended prioritizing based on caliber, which is a new concept we presented in the paper. And we also suggested last come, first serve. So a larger proportion of the results of ballistic imaging would be done before the corresponding criminal cases occur. And they also recommended that. I also have two papers on sexual assault kits. The first paper was at Journal of Forensic Sciences, where it won an award. And it's the first cost effectiveness analysis for testing sexual assault kits. There's at least at one time a few years ago, there was a backlog of about 400,000 kits that had not been tested nationwide. And we conservatively estimated, using data from Detroit, that for every dollar you spend testing a sexual assault kit, you save $81 in the costs associated with future sexual assaults that are averted by testing the kit. And we have an op-ed in CNN.com on this. And then when I presented this work at the Department of Justice, their head of biometrics, he recommended a problem to me. So they had recommended that when you test the backlog, you only test a small portion of the DNA samples within a kit. But he told me we really don't know if that's a good idea or not. So I worked with San Francisco Police Department and have data on that. And this paper appeared in PNAS. So it's more of an operational problem, but we found that we had 25 covariates for each of about 1,000 sexual assaults. And we found that the machine learning model performed better than the nurse examiners at choosing which samples to test and even which samples to originally take from the victim. But today I want to talk about something else called forensic genetic genealogy. It's a brand new approach to solving, up to this point, mostly homicides, cold cases, and I think it's fair to say it's revolutionized the way these cases are solved. So after the introduction that I give, I'm going to present the main results up front, which hopefully will whet your appetite for the remainder of the talk. So this hit the media exactly 4 years ago. I don't know if you can see this, but the date of this is April 25th, 2018, New York Times article, when they caught the so-called Golden State Killer. So what happened here? How did they find him? So these are the steps in the FGG, stands for forensic genetic genealogy. So the first thing you do, you know, when you have a DNA sample from a crime scene, is you compare it to the DNA profiles in the national database of DNA profiles from felons. And this one from the Golden State Killer did not get a match. And like many others in the country that don't get a match, if you don't have any other leads, the case goes cold and sits around for decades. So now in this new approach, you perform genotyping, you get what's called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNP data. And the key thing here that's new is that there's these two companies that have emerged. One is called GEDmatch. The other one is called FTDNA, or Family Tree DNA. And so law enforcement can take the SNP data, make up a fake name like John Smith or something, send it to GEDmatch, and GEDmatch will send you back a list of names and email addresses of many people, hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 people who are related to this unknown criminal. Here in the talk, I'll be referring to this, you know, murderer as the target, and also to give you some estimate of how closely related each of these people in the list are to the target. Then this output of the list of relatives is given to a team of genealogists, And in the Golden State Killer case, I think they had 1 or 2 third cousins, and you try to build out a family tree from this list of matches. And this took a number of months, and then they focused in on 2 sets of cousins. They tried someone who was a cousin of the Golden State Killer, and it wasn't him. Then finally they focused on the Golden State Killer. They followed him to a Starbucks. After he threw away his coffee cup, they grabbed it, took DNA from it, and got a perfect hit from the original DNA sample. And he is now serving life in prison. So today, our paper here focuses on this 3rd step. And this is the bottleneck, by far the bottleneck step in terms of time, but it's also a bottleneck in terms of the number of crimes that you solve. So just one more slide on kind of how this world works. So people were happy that they caught the Golden State Killer, but quickly there was an uproar about privacy because this company GEDmatch had 1.4 million users in their database, and they did not tell the users that they were allowing law enforcement to use their system. And as a result, they switched to an opt-in system, and have roughly 20% of the people have opted in thus far. Interestingly, the field is pioneered by 4 women. 2 of them are my co-authors, Colleen and Margaret. C.C. Moore, you may have seen on the Finding Your Roots TV show, and Barbara Ray Venter was the one who caught the Golden State Killer. So over the last 4 years, some of these small FGG companies have been bought up by large companies. So for example, C.C. Moore essentially is an employee of Parabon now. The FBI has their own in-house team that does forensic genetic genealogy, but most police departments outsource this to these small FGG companies. And in the last several years, several hundred cold cases have been solved. Companies are keeping data, under their belt, but generally thought to be about 50% of the cases that they attempt to solve, they're successful at solving. So the people I'm working with, so the DNA Doe Project is somewhat different. First, it's a nonprofit. And the main thing is that it does not solve criminal cases. It solves a mathematically equivalent problem, but they focus on identifying unidentified human remains. So for example, you find someone homeless or a drug addict dead in an alleyway, they have no identification on them, you have no idea who they are, but you want to let their family know. And so you take DNA, and then, then essentially it's the same problem. And this company actually has an interesting business model where it's entirely crowdsourced. So the volunteers themselves are almost all retired women. Some work 10 or 20 hours a week. Some work like 60 hours a week. In a sense, my 2 co-authors, the co-founders of DNA Doe Project, are there in this is their retirement gig. Colleen is a physicist who owned a company who sold parts to NASA, and Margaret was a crime novelist, and now they're doing this. Okay, so this is the first mathematical analysis of the back end of the FGG process. That is, how do you go from the GEDmatch output to identifying the target? And the paper has 2 types of analysis. The first one is performance analysis, which I'm not going to talk about today, but basically given the GEDmatch output, we compute 2 performance measures: the probability of identifying the target, that is, of solving the case. And the second one is the expected workload. And here by workload, I mean the number of people in the final family tree that is created. So instead, I'm going to focus on the more interesting question of optimization. So you give this GEDmatch output to a team of genealogists. And what do they do next? There's like over 1,000 people on the list. So, which match do you investigate next? How many do you investigate? When and if do you descend from possible most recent common ancestors? I'll define this part in a couple of slides. So we have data from 17 cases from DNA Doe Project. At the time we received the data, 8 of the 17 cases were solved. There's great variation of the difficulty of these cases. Some of them were easily solved after investigating a couple dozen matches. Other cases remain unsolved after investigating several hundred matches. So now I want to talk for a few slides about the informational assumptions. So this decision maker who's deciding how to build out the family tree, what information do they have? So this is what the output from GEDmatch looks like. Column of names and emails, and the column we're focused on is called the total centimorgan value. This is the amount of shared DNA each of these matches. So each row is a different person, a different match to the unknown target. And the total centimorgan is the amount of DNA that's shared between the match and the unknown target. And there exists in the literature ways to derive the probability distribution of the relationship of a match to the unknown target based on the total centimorgan. So for the first person has 182 total centimorgan, you kind of turn your head sideways in this multicolored thing, and you can see, there's 4 possibilities with the corresponding probabilities of these groups. And then there's a second level where you can find the probability distribution within each group. And then we also assume there's something called the auto cluster tool inside GEDmatch, and we assume that we have access to this tool also. And what it does, it has nothing to do with the unknown target, but it can take any list of matches that you give it and put it in a block diagonal form, grouping together people who have common ancestors. And the darker colors will be people who share, say, grandparents, and the lighter shaded colors would be people who share great grandparents or maybe great great grandparents. Okay, so that's the information we have. So now I'm going to present the main results. And what we're going to do is compare the performance of 2 policies. So the first policy is what I call the benchmark strategy, and this is meant to crudely represent what is done in practice. So the idea is that you search for common ancestors between any 2 matches. So you're not really directly focused on the unknown target. You just are investigating new matches. And then if you find, and then as you're building the tree back, if you find, someone who's, say, great grandparents of 2 of these matches, then you think that they may also be related to the target. And so, it's kind of a 2-stage process. First you ascend up a tree, go backward in time, looking for ancestors. Then when you find these common ancestors, you descend or move forward in time, looking at the descendants of these common ancestors. And what you're looking for near the end of the search is a marriage that is an intersection between someone who's on the mother's side of this target's family tree and someone on the father's side of the family tree. And then assuming that there's no endogamy, that is no inbreeding, then the unknown target should be a descendant of this marriage. And so in this strategy, we're going to have 1 parameter, which is n, the number of matches that we investigate. We're going to prioritize them just like they are in GEDmatch by the highest total centimorgan value. And then by varying n, we can generate a trade-off curve between our 2 main performance measures. Okay, so this is the main results. So if you're only going to, pay attention for 2 or 3 minutes, now is a good time. So first I'll describe how we did this. So we have 17 cases from DNA Doe. We simulate each case 500 times. So we have 8,500 simulations in total. This red curve, trade-off curve, is the benchmark strategy I described on the last slide. So if we look at a particular point on this curve, say this point right here, then the way to interpret this is that if we restrict the size of the family tree to be 15,000 people, then the proportion of the 8,500 simulations that we solve is 37.5%, 0.375 here. So vertical axis probability to solve the case, horizontal axis is the workload. So of course we'd like to live in the upper left corner here where we're solving lots of cases but not doing much work. So this blue dashed curve is our proposed strategy, and it solves cases much more quickly. I could, depending if I measure like, the horizontal distance or vertical distance, whatever, you could get different answers. But I think conservatively, it's solving cases at least 10 times quicker than the benchmark strategy. For example, when the workload is restricted to 7,500, at this point, the proposed strategies already solved 94% of the cases, whereas the benchmark strategy has only solved 4% of the cases. So the rest of the talk, I really want to do two things. First is to give you some idea of how we derived and constructed the proposed strategy. And the second one is to give you some idea of its behavior. What is it that it does that makes it solve cases so much more quickly than the benchmark strategy? But first, I'm going to just have a little bit on parameter estimation. So the model actually has very few parameters. They're mostly about the probability you can identify certain people when you're generating the tree. So first of all, this is the probability you can identify a match that's in GEDmatch. And so that was easy to estimate from all our data, and it's about 60%. And the reason it's so small is that many people use alias names and alias email addresses in GEDmatch. So even though you have a name and email address, it may not mean anything. The next one's, so in our case, there was only one case in all of our data, thousands of instances, that we found someone but could not find their spouse. So we simply assume probably you can identify someone's spouse as 1. So later when I talk about, say, a most recent common ancestor, I'm really talking about an ancestral couple. So a great-grandparent, great-grandfather and a great-grandmother together. We were hoping to identify the last two probabilities jointly from the data, but the data weren't detailed enough. So we estimated that the probability, if you find someone in the family tree, probably that you can find a child of theirs is 0.98 based on a 2% non-paternity rate. And then we have kind of an elaborate simulation procedure using all the data in the 17 cases to estimate the probability that if you have someone in the tree that you can find their parents, and that ended up being about 0.6. In a sensitivity analysis, we reduced 0.98 to 0.9, and the 0.6 went up to 0.64. And the only other data we needed were the mean number of children per couple. And so we used the US fertility rate, which went down pretty linearly from 7 children. I see Jing Dong smiling. That's a big number. From 7 children down to 2 children, from 1800 down to 1930. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the modeling. So again, we'll start with a list of, from GEDmatch, list of matches to the unknown target. And again, there's an ascending stage and descending. So I'm going to focus mostly on the ascending stage where we're building the family tree up that is backwards in time from the matches. And this is a very key point in the analysis, that whereas the benchmark strategy didn't really focus on the target, they focused on finding ancestors of two different matches. We're focused explicitly on finding the most recent common ancestors between each match and the unknown target. And we, keep track of the state of the system, of the progress we're making towards that. So what is a most recent common ancestor? So it's, if you have a first cousin, your most recent common ancestor between you and your first cousin is the common set of grandparents that you have. If you have a second cousin, then it's the great grandparents that you have. So I'm going to go through a toy example. You should keep in mind these cases, in the end, they have thousands of people in their family tree. So these are really big, complicated problems, but to just get the basic idea across, I'm just going to look at a toy problem. So suppose the unknown target, so the murderer, is in red, and suppose the green second cousin is someone from GEDmatch. Now we define something called a cluster, which is a different cluster for each ancestral couple of the unknown target. So in this case, we're only going 3 generations back. And so we have 7 clusters in this example, 7 clusters. We have the target's parents, their 2 sets of grandparents, and their 4 sets of great-grandparents. A particular interest in this toy problem is the leftmost set of great-grandparents, because they are indeed the most recent common ancestors between the red target and the green second cousin, although at this point we don't know that. So this is how, so first we define generations. So there's discrete generations, and the target is in generation 0, target's parents generation 1, and so forth. So for each generation G, in each of the 2 to the G-1 clusters in that generation, we define 2 quantities, L and P. So L stands for list, and P stands for probability. So L is the size of the list. It's the number of possible most recent common ancestors that we've identified thus far. And P is the probability that this list that we have contains the true correct MRCA, for most recent common ancestor. So let's go back to our example here. So again, the second cousin we have them, they're in GEDmatch. And so now we're going to try to identify, get their identity, and then try to go back 3 generations to find their great-grandparents. So when we do that, the random variable, in a sense, L, the list size L, is going to be either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on how many of these that we find. So that'll be kind of the state of the system after we perform this random search. In the corresponding probability, of course, if we come up empty, list is 0, the probability that we found the true one, again, which is the rightmost one of these 4 green ones, probability is 0. And if we find all 4, then the probability is 1, although we actually won't know which of the 4 is the true one, but we'll know that the list contains it. In a simpler world, one would hope that if the list size were 1, 2, or 3, then these probabilities would just be 1/4, 1/2, and 3/4. But in fact, they are not. And it's much more complicated. It takes, pages of calculations in the appendix to just, there's no rocket science there, just probability 101, but it's pretty tedious to compute these probabilities. Now suppose we have a second person in the GEDmatch list who's the first cousin here in black, and suppose we investigate them and try to go back 3 generations. So if we do, and we find that one of their great-grandparents is this set of great-grandparents, which are also the great-grandparents of the second cousin, again, assuming there's no inbreeding, you can infer that this set great-grandparents is the true most recent common ancestor between, these matches and the target. This is indeed how the benchmark strategy works. So in this case, the state of our system changes from L equals 4, P equals 1 to L equals 1, P equals 1. So we know at that point, we would know it's exactly this one that's the true MRCA, and we throw away these other 3. Now, alternatively, I don't have it pictured here, but one could imagine the second cousin, we only found 2 of these when we searched, say, the leftmost 2 green ones. And then when we searched the first cousin, we may have found 3 of them. And then the list size would become 5, and then we'd have to calculate the probability we had the true one. So the list size can get bigger than 4. Okay, the descending stage is more straightforward. We're building the family tree down, forwards in time, and you're looking for a marriage between the 2 sides of the family tree. So for example, you could have a first cousin in purple here. If the left side, the green side, is the father's side of the target's family tree, then this is the mother's side. We find the first cousin on the mother's side, go up 2 generations, find the grandparents who they have in common, descend from the purple grandparents on the mother's side, descend from the green great parents on the father's side, find this marriage or intersection, and then you know that the target has to be a descendant, and in this toy example, an actual child of that marriage. Okay, so let's go. So now I want to go in a little more with that as background of just, how do we try to find how do we come up with this proposed strategy? So we're using, we formulated it as a stochastic dynamic program. So the state of the system here, the dimension of the state is like in the hundreds of thousands or something. It's really big. So I'll just describe what's in the state of the system. So we have the list of uninvestigated matches. So in our 17 DNA Doe cases, the average number of matches per case was something like 1,700. So you have lots of those. For each of those, you're keeping track of the centimorgan value, the amount of shared DNA, and then you're keeping track of essentially the 1,700 squared amount of information in that auto cluster matrix. So that's what you know about the matches. Then for each, as you're building the tree out, for each cluster in each generation, we're keeping track of the P and the L, which is what I've just been describing for the last few slides. And in our analysis, we allow multiple dissensions from the same cluster, from the same list, and so we have to keep track the last time we descended from it, who was in the list that we already descended from, because there's no reason to descend from them again. And then we have 3 types of actions we can take. So we can start an ascending search, that is a new search. You take someone off the GEDmatch list, and based on their centimorgan value and their auto cluster information, you decide that you want to investigate them. You can start a new descending search from some cluster in some generation based on the P and the L value, or you can simply throw up your hands and cut your losses and end the search. And our objective is going to be to maximize the probability we solve the case, that is, identify the target, minus a cost on the expected workload. So think of the cost as a Lagrange multiplier that we just essentially pluck out of the air. So, maybe someone like my Stanford colleague, Ben Van Roy, can solve this with, approximate dynamic programming or something. We just didn't try to go that route. And again, the state space is absolutely enormous. So we didn't try to do this explicitly. What we did do is, by hand, we have equations in the appendix of the paper where we derive the state transition probability. So for every single state, and again, there's huge number of states, and for every single possible action, we compute what's the probability, probability distribution over the next state. And then from that, we derive 5 structural results that very partially characterize an optimal strategy. And then we simply construct a one parameter strategy. It has one parameter, a threshold. And this strategy is consistent with these 5 structural results that we derive. And the strategy ends up being myopic in nature and based on the concept of cost effectiveness. So given that you're in a certain state and you take a certain action, we compute what I call delta P, the increase in the probability of solving the case, and delta W, the extra workload you incur by taking this action. And think of the cost effectiveness as being delta P divided by delta W. And in a little more detail, but not real detail, here's a little bit on the proposed strategy. So again, it's a myopic approach. The single parameter we have is a threshold C. So given the current state of the system, so first we know from our structural results that it's kind of best to descend before ascending. If there's a good reason to descend from a cluster, you should do it. So first we look into whether we should descend. So given the current state, then we compute delta P, we compute delta W sub D, the subscript D stands for descending. And for each cluster and generation, and then if the maximum over all these clusters, the maximum cost effectiveness is greater than this parameter C, then we descend from this maximal cluster. If not, if the best cost effectiveness is below this threshold C, then we instead think about ascending, that is starting a new search. So here, you can't be perfectly myopic here, because if you do a new search, there's no way you're going to solve the case in one step, because all the new search does was improve the P and the L and hopefully help you find a most recent common ancestor, but it's not going to, find a marriage and find a case, because that happens in the descending part. So instead we compute for each cluster generation, we assume that we ascend n star times. So we compute n star, which is the minimum number of new investigations we do, so that the expected state in terms of the P and the L are such that the cost effectiveness, if you descend after doing this n star times, is bigger than the threshold C. And if that's the case, so you calculate that, and then we find the maximum over all these cluster generations of basically the next n star plus 1 actions, where you're investigating n star new investigations, then descending. And this is the probability you solve the case. This is the workload in both the ascending parts and the descending parts. If this whole cost effectiveness is bigger than the threshold C, then you ascend from this cluster generation, which is essentially you start a new match with a maximum centimorgan within this cluster generation, which you get that data from the auto cluster tool. Otherwise, if the biggest one is less than C, then you basically give up and stop the search. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of the time, maybe I'll just pause here. Anybody have any, I didn't look at the chat yet. Let me just see, does anybody have any questions?
Quick question, is your little c the same as your cost in the dynamic program?
Right, good question. It is not. So we never actually use, although it plays the same role of varying the parameter, ends up being similar to changing the Lagrange multiplier, but we don't directly use the Lagrange multiplier. I mean, it's used when we do the structural results, to get a form of a policy, but there's no direct. Thanks, Neil. Okay, so now I want to spend the rest of the time just giving you a sense of how this proposed strategy behaves, how it differs from the benchmark strategy. So how does it solve cases 10 times quicker? So the first thing I want to talk about is that, I'm sorry, there's one important thing I forgot to tell you. So this is back on the informational assumptions of the proposed strategy. So at the very beginning, before you investigate someone, you have a probability distribution of their relationship to the unknown target. But once you, if you successfully investigate them, that is, you can actually take a real name and a real email address, to someone on GEDmatch, then, you essentially know their age. You pretty much usually know the age of the target, and that we assume that you then know the relationship. So for example, I won't go all the way back, but like there's a group B of relationships, and it's either, like a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, or a niece or a grandchild. We assume if you know the age, it's easy to kind of say, well, that must be a grandparent of the target or whatever. And we put this past the experts in the field. They think this is a reasonable assumption. But anyways, by making that assumption and using the auto cluster information, our strategy, once we find someone, we know how many generations to go back to find the correct most recent common ancestor between the match and the target. Whereas the benchmark strategy does not necessarily do that. So let M1, M2, and T be two matches and a target, and let G of XY be the generation of the MRCA between individuals X and Y. So the lower the number, the closer the relationship between individuals X and Y. So if two people were first cousins, X and Y, then G would be 2, because you have to go back to their grandparents. Then what happens, the distinction between the proposed and benchmark strategies really depend on the left-hand side of this equation, on how closely related the two matches are, versus the right side, which is how closely related the target is to the closer of the two matches. And so this can either be, this red here is equal, but there's 3 cases whether it's equal to, greater than, or less than. So in the equal to case, it's great for the benchmark strategy. Essentially, you get equivalent outcomes, which is kind of what I showed in the toy problem I showed you with the red target and green second cousin, that held there. In case 2, if the two matches are more closely related than either of them are to the target, then you don't go up high enough. And this would have happened actually with the first cousin in black if we only went up 1 generation. It turns out the MRCA of 2 matches in this case cannot be related to the target, cannot be an ancestor of the target. And so you undershoot and you fail to solve some cases that you would have solved. And then in the third case, where the two matches are more distantly related than the closest matches to the target, then you overshoot. And so you'll eventually descend from the right ancestors, but it's very inefficient, and you end up descending from, you're supposed to only go to the grandparent level. Instead, you go to the great-great-grandparent level, and then you're descending from all these great-great-grandparents. And if you remember how many children people had back in the 1800s and stuff, just you end up wasting a lot of time of descending from people who are unrelated to the target. Okay, the second thing, so I had put this up before, the second difference between the proposed and benchmark is that proposed strategy uses the auto cluster tool, that matrix information, to prioritize among the ascending actions based on the cost effectiveness, where the benchmark strategy doesn't do that. And the most interesting aspect really is the third one, is that the benchmark strategy, only descends from common ancestors. So at least these people are related. Whereas in the proposed strategy, they aggressively descend from this list, where the probability the list contains the true MRCA is actually quite small. And so in all our simulations, we have almost 100,000 descents, where you're descending from the people in a list and trying to find marriages under them. And it turns out, averaged over these 100,000 descents, the probability that the list contains the correct MRCA is only 0.38, and yet it's still, does 10 times better. So a key part of why this works so well is that it doesn't wait until you are pretty sure you have the correct MRCA. It descends much quicker than this. A few other things about the proposed strategy. The mean list size at the time of descent, that the value L is 5.5. In one case, it got up to 76. On average, you perform about a dozen descents per case. And you do that with about 6 distinct ancestral couples or 6 distinct clusters. So on average for clusters you descend from them twice. The great majority of work, in terms of the size of the family tree, happens in the descent, where you're way up high and then you're finding 7 children and 7 times 7 grandchildren and so on and so forth. And the sequence of actions depends on the detailed network structure in a complicated way. And I'll show that. Just to check here, I have like 9:17. Am I supposed to stop at 9:20 or 9:30?
9. I think you aim to stop maybe at 9:20, but I think we have time. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a few more slides, so maybe I'll just. Yeah. I don't have time to describe this because it's kind of complicated, but it shows that the average descent, whenever you descend, that's these red things and the probability on the sides. This is just one sample path from one simulation, but you're descending even if the chance it has the true MRCA is only like 5% or 10%. But the key point here is really there's no rhyme or reason, there's no obvious insights here, and it varies. Even within a case, you simulate one case 500 times and you get many different, the nature of the optimal or not optimal nature of the proposed strategy can vary quite a bit. So I just want to briefly talk about limitations and then wrap up. So first, we only have 17 cases, so small sample size. It turns out they're not chosen randomly. We just queried the team leaders and for data on cases, and we used what we got. So this list I'm going to put up now, I would treat them as future research topics. I think it was appropriate in this first cut of the problem because it really is a complicated problem to not include these, but I think these are natural things to look at. So we assume no inbreeding, that is, anybody who gets married in our family trees are unrelated to each other, and that's actually not true in real life. We assume no half relationships, although that wouldn't be hard to generalize to. 2 things that are, that aren't in the model that are in real life are geographical information and ethnicity information, particularly the geography. The actual genealogists, try to exploit that as much as they can. I think I'll skip over on these things. Okay, so as a result of these limitations, I think the probability we identify the target and the expected workload, our 2 main performance measures, are useful primarily in relative terms. But police departments and FGG companies need to assess the solvability up front. And so, for example, most, take New York City Police Department, they have, hundreds of unsolved homicide cases. They don't have the budget to put these through FGG, all of them, but if you got the GEDmatch output from all these cases, we can do our performance analysis and prioritize, let them know, rank them by how easy or difficult the cases are, which could be a key input into which ones they decide this year to look at. And also the way it works now is the government gives, the police departments give these companies a certain amount of money, like $1,500 for a certain amount of hours of work, and then the company comes back and either solves the case or doesn't solve it. And if they don't solve it, then the police departments have to kick in more money. Often they don't kick in more money. And so, if everyone, the FGG companies adopted our strategy, if the strategy indeed, solve cases 10 times faster, you could solve a lot more of these cases. Hard cases appear to be solvable, but require a lot of workload. These curves really flatten out kind of. Key point is the proposed strategy solves cases, at least 10 times faster. From a modeling point of view, the key thing is that we're tracking the progress with the P and the L of finding most recent common ancestors between the target and each match. And then this proposed strategy seems to aggressively descend from these lists, even if they don't seem, a low likelihood that they actually have the true MRCA. And in the end, genealogy is as much an art as a science, so our proposed strategy is meant to aid and not to replace genealogist's decision. So just the last slide is just on next steps. So I gave a talk at their annual conference, ISHI, the International Symposium on Human Identification, in September in Orlando, to over 500 people there. One of the people was the head of the FBI FGG group, and he runs the thing in the middle, SWIGDAM, the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods. And he invited me to give a virtual talk to them, which I did a month later. And then I gave a talk to a few hundred people at the annual American Association of Forensic Sciences. So from the SWIGDAM talk, there was a bioethicist on this small panel, and she proposed a problem that we're now looking into. It turns out the way this is done in practice, you can have a family tree, the genealogists are stuck, they can't get any further. And so they take a few people on the family tree, not people from the GEDmatch list. This is further on, and you have other people and you think they're related to the target, but you don't know. And they actually, law enforcement knocks on their door, explains to them, we're trying to find a murderer and we think you're a distant relative of them. Would you be willing to share your DNA with us? And this bioethicist felt this was unethical. It's done way too much. It's certainly an invasion of privacy, she said. And so we're just basically looking at, we're adding this targeted testing as a fourth option in the optimal stopping problem, essentially, in the stochastic dynamic program. And so that it would tell you, which of all these people in the family tree would be most informative to target test, and then ideally be able to get a sense of how much target testing, how much does it really help performance, and how much does it make sense to do. So there's a lot of interest in this from this community, in particular GEDmatch. So GEDmatch is this company that's at the center of this ecosystem. Every single case that's attempted to be solved by FGG is kind of run through GEDmatch, and they gave us data on every single case, almost 1,000 cases that people have attempted to solve using this approach. And they didn't give us names or anything. They just gave us a list of centimorgan values for each of these 900 cases. We ran our performance analysis tool. And so this really does allow us to get over this relative aspect. So now we can kind of nail down, take a new case, compare it to the probability distribution of how hard these other 908 cases are. And so this is quite helpful. We're also testing the optimization tool on an open cold case, but I can't really tell you more about that. Okay, thanks for your interest.
Well, let's thank Larry for a very interesting talk. Do we have any questions? So I actually have a quick question. So I think this is more out of my ignorance about this area. So you mentioned that the kind of mapping out this whole genealogy tree and everything, it takes months for, let's say, the police department to do that. Where are the main bottlenecks? Is it figuring out the, and also the trees where you have edges between the nodes? Are they deterministic edges?
No. So that's when I have the slide on parameter estimates. So there's two kind of bottlenecks here. So one is only about 60% of the people in the GEDmatch output in the list can you actually convert that name in an email into an actual person, figure out who they are.
Yes.
And then the second one, given that you know somebody in the tree, the chances that you can find their parents is only also about 60%. So, you may be back in the 1800s or 1700s, or it could be, it really, that's why I think we actually had some ethnicity data, but it turned out for about half the cases, but they all had the same, they're all Western European. And, we hypothesized that different ethnicities, there may be different search probabilities,
right?
Because some ethnicities is easier to get records and others there aren't. But anyways, it can be hard to go back in time once, you have to go back to Europe or go back to some other country and you can't find the records of them. So that's key bottleneck, if I'm following your question.
Right.
Yeah. And then the other one is just the sheer, so this just blows up exponentially, if you're going, it really depends. And that's why we have this performance analysis tool, is estimating how big the final family tree is given the, GEDmatch output. So some cases are really quite easy. You can solve them literally in hours or a couple of days. And other ones, they've been sitting around, they've been trying to solve them for a year and they still can't solve them.
Thanks.
You mentioned a bit of it's like an optimal stopping problem, and you mentioned it in terms of thresholds. I was wondering if you sort of think of it like as a one-step look-ahead rule kind of method. Is that some of the intuition behind the policy?
Yeah, certainly on the descending part, you can think of it as a one-step look-ahead. On the when you're investigating a new match, we have that kind of N star investigate. So we have to decide how many times do you need to ascend to get into a place where it makes sense to descend. And then this is N star plus 1 actions. And then, so instead of just one step look ahead, it's kind of N star plus 1 look ahead, where you have to compute what N star is.
Okay. And do you have a paper on this as well? Is that?
Yeah, it's not quite ready. I'll email it to you once. I just been advised not to distribute it yet, but it's out for review.
All right. If there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker again.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry.
Yeah. Oh, there's Jim. Hey, Jim. Okay. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Larry.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.